Imaging Part 2. In this nugget, we discuss imaging. This is Part 2, where we'll talk about how to capture an image. This would be our reference image that has all of our ideal configuration that we talked about previously. When I decide I've got the image just the way I want it, I'm going to use the ImageX utility to be able to capture this to a WIM file. Once it's in the WIM file, very often we'll then copy it up to a network location. I can also use WDS, or Windows Deployment Services, to create a boot capture item, which would be based upon a boot INI file. Once I've got that configured, I can boot to this, connect to my WDS server, and then use a UI with a next finish to be able to capture a WIM file to my WDS server. I can also then, once I've got it all captured using one of these two methods, I can use a deploy image method, again using one of these two methods. I can use ImageX to then copy the file to a properly prepared and partitioned hard drive, and then I can apply that image. Once that's been done and the partition is active and we've appropriately set the boot properties, we will then be able to boot into a new installation of Windows based on the reference. You can also use a UI. WDS also does this for us, although it can be a little bit twitchy at times, and I'll show you that when we demonstrate this later on. Alright, remember from our last nugget that we used the OSCD IMG utility to create an ISO file. I put mine in the WinPE directory, and there it is. It has all of the common tools that I'll need, and it has a boot environment that allows us to boot the WinPE operating environment. I'm using VMware, so I'm just pointing my virtual DVD to this particular ISO file, and it interprets it as a literal and physical DVD drive or CD-ROM drive, as you can see here. And this is what it boots me to. It boots me right to this command prompt. One thing I want to point out, though, is it takes me to Drive X. What in the world is that? That's just a RAM disk, a RAM drive, where it's not really a physical hardware. It's just a little bit of the operating system stored in memory. And then it has the I ran the disk part utility. This is also part of WinPE tools, so just be aware of that. It's part of the WinPE tools. And what I did is I ran that because I wanted to identify the various volumes that I had here, because I wasn't sure what the drive letters were going to map out as. And I found out here that my drive letter D is my CD-ROM, where my WinPE tools DVD is. And then drive C here is the Windows 7 operating system drive. All right. Now, what I want to do next is to capture this. This is the whole point of what we're about to do here, and it's a big part of the exam objectives, is that you want to be able to capture an image. So, what I'm doing here is I'm going to use the ImageX utility, which again is part of the CD that we have for our WinPE operating system, /capture. I'm telling it that I want to capture drive C, and then I have to tell it where to put the capture and what to name it. I'm telling it to put it on drive C. Yes, this is different than a lot of sector-based utilities, because you cannot both capture and save data on the same drive. In this case, since it's a file-based capture, I can capture drive C and store the file on drive C. So it's not reflexive or anything like that. Or that's not what I want to say. It's not like a circular reference of some kind. So here we have it being captured there, called Win7 Ref Capture. Then you don't really have to be too elaborate with this part, but I usually put it in as plain of English as I can. This is my Windows 7 reference capture. Put in quotation marks, which is necessary because of these spaces that we have in between here. Then a / compress. Now you can do a compress maximum, compress none, or compress fast. I usually choose maximum because the speed of processors right now is pretty high, and so it's not really going to be that much of a performance penalty compared to fast or none, and it will also save me more hard drive space in the long run. And you can also verify, just meaning that it's going to check through the file that it's creating to make sure that the files are all there properly. So then once I've got all that in place, I simply press enter here, and we see it starting to scan files and directories. Oh, I also want to point something else out here. Notice that it's skipping several different files here. Why is that? Well, let me show you something. Well, first of all, notice that it's excluding these files, which are things you wouldn't want. I mean, you won't want the client-side cache, because that's just offline files, which will have a copy on the network server anyway. It doesn't capture any of the recycle bin. It doesn't capture the page file or hyperfill.sys. These are all files that will be These last two files would be recreated anyway in a new machine that would receive the image that we're capturing. But what I could also do is, let me drag this over here, in my ISO directory from the WinPE directory that I create, I could also create another file here, and I'm just going to choose a new Notepad file. And this new file, new text document, this new file could be called wimscript.ini, not txt. Okay, wimscript.ini. I'm going to change that. And then what you do with this is you can crack it open in Notepad and you can create your own exclusion list. Exclusion list, one word, in square brackets. And then you just name the files, myfile.doc. If I don't want that one to be copied, I'll type that. You can also use wildcards like any, MP3 files or something like that. So you can just create those kinds of those exclusions if you want. And here's another thing you could do. You can also exclude certain compression items. So again, in brackets, square brackets, compression exclusion list. Hopefully I typed that right. And then you could exclude anything that's already compressed. For example, JPEG files are already compressed images, compressed graphic files. If you try to compress them anymore, you hardly get any benefit out of it. So it doesn't take the processor time to try to crunch down a JPEG file when it's already compressed as it is. Or any, you can also add, star.zip. You can also add, what's another one? Star.cab. Those are all files that are already compressed. There's not much sense in trying to recompress those. So anyway, this might not be an exam issue, but it might be useful for your own future use, so I wanted to let you know about it. Alright, so now you can see here that we have successfully captured that image. Didn't take too long, 19 minutes. And then what we have here is on the C drive. If we do a dir, you'll see that I've got the win7ref capture.wim file. The entire operating system, everything that's comprised of, is contained in that WIM file. But it may not do me much good on the hard drive where it resides right now. It would probably be better if I would map a drive to a network location and then copy this file over to that network location. So to demonstrate that, what I've done here then is I want to just go to a command prompt where I type netuse asterisk, which would be drive letter Z, and then whack whack James Win7. That's just my own Windows 7 computer. And I mapped an administrative share to the drive letter $, because I don't have any other manually created shares there yet. And the $, anytime you see a $, that'll be the administrative share. Meaning that if I'm an administrator of this local computer, I should be able to browse that entire drive as if I were seated locally at that machine. So then once I did that, it said the password that I'm currently logged on is invalid. So I need to provide the credentials that might work on that computer, and then, along with the password. And then now we have drive Z connected to that computer. Now what I can do is simply type the copy command to copy this file over there. And then to copy that file, I'm simply typing in here, copy win7ref capture.wim, that's the name of this capture file that we saw up here, to the z:\wim files directory, which I've already created over on the other computer. And then you can see here what I've also done is once the file was copied, I deleted that WIM file. Yeah, here I actually typed delete star.wif. Didn't mean to type that, but I meant to type delete star.wim, which is this file here. The reason why I did that is because at some future point in time, it's likely that I'll modify this image for some reason, and I'll want to recapture an image of that whole hard drive. Well, I don't want this old WIM to be part of my new capture, so I had to delete it. I could have also just as easily done the whole thing in one fell swoop by using the move command instead of copy. Alright, now here I want to emphasize that I was using the WinPE and ImageX to capture that image to the hard drive and then copy it over the network to a suitable destination. Here I'm in Windows Deployment Services, and within this I can use the UI instead to create a capture WIM, is what we called it. This is just two different ways of accomplishing the same task. You can see here, for example, that at some point in the past in the boot images location, I've used Windows Server 2008 capture to capture Windows Server 2008 machines. In fact, that's how I captured, where did it go? This Dell machine that I showed you earlier. There it is, the Dell 410 capture. Well, that was created using one of those boot images, this one right here. All right, it was pretty much the same idea, just a different method for capturing it. Here, if I wanted to use Windows 7 for a capture, I could go down here, right-click, and choose Capture, Create Capture Image. Now, let me tell you something else about this as well. The boot images here really are pretty much the same across all versions of current Windows. So I can actually boot to the Windows Server 2008 capture on a Windows 7 computer and still be able to capture the machine. Okay, but for sake of being intuitive here, I'm just going to go ahead and create a capture based on Windows 7. All right, so we'll right-click on it, choose Create Capture Image, which launches a handy little wizard. And what I'm going to do with this is just rename it so it's more intuitive. Capture. Like that. And then I'll do this one right here as well. And then I need to specify the location and the file name. Notice that there's already a couple of WIM files there for my, what have I got there? Windows 7 Enterprise and Ultimate Edition. So now I'm just going to call this one Capture to make it, again, more plain or identifiable as to what its main purpose is. And then I'll go ahead and choose Open here. Then once that's done, I'll just go ahead and click on Next. And now it's going to extract an image from the source image files, which was referenced as my Windows 7 image files. And then what's going on here is that it already finished that capture, and then after that it prompted me to see if I wanted to add this image to the WDS server, because even though the WIM file is created, it may not necessarily appear in the interface for WDS. So as a separate step, I went ahead and prompted it to, or rather chose to say yes to add it here, and that's what it's doing. And then now what we're looking at here is I've booted up a bare metal computer to the network, and we can see here that it's going to allow me to now to use a Windows 7 capture. So I'll just press Enter here, and it's going to go through mostly the same process that we've seen before. It's going to go into, it's going to go ahead and boot into a WinPE environment, and from that point I'll then be able to capture it. But instead of using ImageX directly, I'll be able to use the interface as opposed to a command line. And so then here, after it's properly booted up, then we can see that we now have a wizard to do this with instead of having to use ImageX. I can use the image capture wizard here and click Next. Then I simply select the volume I want to capture, give it a name, and I'll just go ahead and type all of this in offline real quick. And that's pretty much it. Then we'll go ahead and click on Next here, and we specify a name and location where we want to where we want to save the install image. The purpose with this one, though, is that normally you want to save it to a local computer first. And you could do this with ImageX or with this utility. And it kind of seems to be the better convention to follow to store it locally first. Because if there's a network interruption, then it could corrupt the image, and you may have to start over again. It may give you a whole troubleshooting scenario that you don't really want to have to deal with. So just save it locally, and then copy it as a secondary action in ImageX. Or, after it's been created here, then you can also optionally choose to upload the image to a WDS server here as well. And then here you can see I've filled in all the blanks, so to speak, and then I would just click on Next. From this point forward, it'll just capture this image, put it on my WDS server, and it's very handy because once it's there, I can then deploy it to any number of destination computers using the tools of WDS. Now, once you've captured your image, they're not going to do you much good just sitting on the hard drive of the server taking up space. So you want to deploy those images to destination computers, and you want to duplicate that reference computer across multiple other destinations. You can do that using the ImageX tool, and you can also do that using the WDS tool. We'll talk first of all about ImageX. Remember, you can access ImageX by just booting with WinPE. Now remember, this is very similar to what we did before when we captured the image. You can use ImageX to both capture an image as well as to deploy an image. Of course, in this case, it's going to be a deployment. Once you've booted up, you want to use the DiskPart utility to create the volumes. Then you will copy the WIM file from wherever it currently is, usually on a server somewhere, down to the volumes that you just created. Then you need to apply that WIM using ImageX. Now what that means is you're going to cause it to expand itself and to create the directory structure on the hard drive where it'll have, like the Windows directory, System32, it'll have program files, all those kinds of things there. Problem is, at that point, it's not going to be bootable quite yet until you use the BCD boot to set the proper drive for the boot. And then once you've done that, or actually, you're going to set the drive and the directory of Windows for the boot. Then once you've done that, you also need to set it as active, because only an active partition, that's a primary partition as well, is bootable. Alright then, what we can see we've done here is I've taken a bare metal machine and I've booted from the Windows PE, or the WinPE bootable CD. Having done that, then, we come to this command prompt. Now, the things that you need to do that I delineated for you on that previous whiteboard, you can type all of that stuff in manually, or you can take advantage of this batch file that I've created for you. What this is going to do is it's going to, first of all, run DiskPart. But you can't really add all of the commands the disk part needs here. So what you need to do is to reference it to, that's what the /s is, refer it to an answer file here, or an instruction set that's I've just called diskprep.txt. And I'm going to show you that file here as well. So this is what it's going to do. It's going to run disk part with whatever instructions are in diskprep.txt, and here are those instructions. It's going to select disk 0, in other words, in ordinal numbering, the first disk that it finds. It's going to clean it, meaning that it's going to remove all partitions. So you got to make sure there's no valuable data on there. It'll create a partition. It's a primary partition, and it's going to make it only 100 megabytes in size. Now let me point something out here. Technically speaking, you're not supposed to have to do this step right here. Okay, this all right through here. Okay, you're not supposed to have to do any of that stuff. You should be able to start right from here, and then you would move this active down to the end here. You'd want to make the partition active as well. Why do I point all of this out? Because you can see here we're creating two partitions. In Windows 7, in default installation, it actually does create two partitions. The first partition is a hidden 100 megabyte partition that's used to contain the system files, which is what's used to boot the operating system. One of the reasons why it divides these two is because it's going to be important if you decide to use BitLocker later on to encrypt the hard drive. When you use BitLocker, it needs that first smaller partition in order to be able to operate and to be able to boot the operating system. Now, when I say this, what Microsoft says is supposed to happen is if you don't create this 100 megabyte partition in the beginning, then they say that it will automatically be created later on. Now, I haven't tested this very many times, but in the times that I have tested not creating that partition, it does not get created the way Microsoft says it will. So, I recommend that you go ahead and create it here anyway, and that's exactly what we've done here. So, once we've created the size of 100 megabytes, we select that partition, which is the first one. That's what the 1 is there. We format it with the NTFS file system, and we label it. You can label it whatever you want. I just call mine system. And then I use quick, which means the format will take place faster, and then I assign it a drive letter. Once that's all been done, I also need to assign that as an active partition, because I need to be able to boot from that. All right? Again, it's going to be an active and a primary partition. Then I need to create the remainder of the space, where my actual Windows file and folders are going to be, where my program files, all the rest of that's going to actually be. Here I'll create partition primary again. This time I'm going to select the second partition on the disk instead of the first one, which is that 100 megabyte one. Now this one, I'm going to format it with the NTFS file system. I'm going to label it Win7 because that's where the actual Windows 7 files are located. Again, it's going to be a quick format. And I'm going to assign it drive letter M. Now don't be concerned about this, because remember, this first partition is going to be hidden. Well, if I'm hiding it, why am I calling it drive letter C? Because you don't see hidden drives. They don't have drive letters. Well, this is only, the drive letters we assign here are only for purposes of the disk prep utility and for other things that we'll do here while we're in this session. When we reboot the computer, these drive letters will be lost and the system will automatically assign whatever's next. So it's going to be C. So this drive right here, right now it's M for our purposes, but on reboot it would become drive C in most instances. Okay? So this is disk part, or rather disk part commands that we're typing here, and we're prepping the disks as necessary, creates two partitions, and then we chose to exit it. Once it's done with those instructions at the end of this line right here, then what it does is it says net use drive letter Z, okay, or you can use an asterisk or whatever drive letter you want there, and then you need to point to the UNC path. You'll have to type in whatever applies in your case here, but generically I'll just say server and share /user, and then again supply your own user account there that has administrative privilege, and then so that it can access this file, and then the password. Okay. Now this will be a password if you decide to use this batch file that you'll have to type in plain text, and it could be conceivable that someone else might be able to open up the file and actually see your password, so do be cautious of that. However, if instead of actually typing the password, you just type in an asterisk, then it will pause and ask you to type in the password, and it does not mask it or anything like that. It just looks, there's nothing that appears on the screen when you type in the password. So that's going to make it a little bit harder to eavesdrop on. Once you've mapped that network drive, however, drive Z in my case, then what you need to do is to copy the WIM file that we talked about earlier. So when you have a WIM that you've got captured, I think mine was Win, Pro 7, something like that. Can't remember exactly right now. But you'll put in the supply here the name of your own WIM file, whichever one you captured, and then you want to copy that file to this drive letter that you have just created. Okay. Then what you want to do is to use the ImageX utility. Notice that this is on drive D. Again, your drive letters may change. If you're not exactly sure, return to disk part and type list volume. Okay, list volume, and that'll show you all of the drive letters that you have. So I'm going to use ImageX again. This time I'm going to apply this capture.wim file that I had previously copied to drive M. So apply drive M's capture.wim to the first partition. And then we're going to apply that to drive M. Actually, this right here is the first operating system instance that appears within the capture.wim file. We didn't really talk about this much, but any kind of a WIM file can actually have multiple operating systems packaged within it. I could have 3, 4, 5 different reference computers all stuffed into a single WIM. Okay, so that certainly is conceivable. So in this case, I'm choosing the first one, and that's also the only one. And I'm going to put it on drive M. Next thing I need to do here is to tell it that I need to boot from that drive and the Windows directory. So I'm going to go back to my M drive here, because now that I've applied it here, I've applied this WIM file, it expands the entire directory structure on my drive M, and it will include the bcd boot command that appears in System32. So then I tell it that I want to boot to the M drive and the Windows directory. Okay, that's my operating system files. Then I tell it, and this is just something, you don't have to do this, but this is what I do. I tell it to shut down, and a /S means to shut down without restarting. /T means time of 0 seconds. In other words, do this right now. So anyway, both of these files, the disk prep as well as the image deploy.bat file, are available for you up on nuggetlab.com if you supply your own answers where necessary there. This will automate this whole process for you. All you would have to do is to go to the appropriate directory. I think it was on D there, wasn't it? And then I'll do a dir to make sure I'm in the right place. Yep, there's image deploy.bat. Then I'll just type image deploy.bat, and I'm done. Then I just go on to the next computer. And then when this user comes in on Monday morning and turns on their computer, they will then have a complete installation from bare metal to a complete and functioning Windows 7 with whatever I've included in that ideal reference image. And then this is the end result of running our batch file and then the disk part commands utilities that we had there also. We have a hard drive that we expanded Windows on. We turned on the computer just a moment ago. Boots up to this desktop, which is exactly what we have with our reference computer. And that's kind of the whole point. I want to duplicate that known good computer to a bunch of other machines. And then another method for performing the deployment here, besides ImageX, would be to deploy with Windows Deployment Services. What I want to do, first of all, is import the image into WDS, like you've seen me do before. And then what I want to do is to boot the Pixie client. Of course, again, we have to do that in order to get to WDS. If I don't have a Pixie client, Pixie compatible network card, I can use a Discover CD instead. Either way, I'm going to get to WDS. Then after I enter in some credentials, I'll select my operating system that I want to deploy. And what I might have to do here, as a kind of a side note, is that if the hard drive is not partitioned in any way, I may need to create that first 100 megabyte partition followed by the remainder of the space for the operating system files. If you don't see a facility to do that, you should be able to, actually, using the advanced options from within the interface, but you could also use F10 if you like, or actually it'd be Shift F10. It takes you to a command prompt, and if you'd rather use disk part, you can do so from there to create that 100 megabyte partition. And this part of it would be the same as what I have in that answer file for disk part that we used with ImageX. And then all, of course, we would do is select the image and then just deploy it to the appropriate partitions. So what we've done so far is we've installed a Windows reference image using the ImageX utility found on WinPE. The next thing we're going to do here is I've booted to a Pixie boot to a WDS server, and then I'm going to go ahead and provide some credentials here in a moment. And then based on those credentials, it'll provide for me any images that I have permissions for. Yes, in WDS you can assign permissions to various images so that some users are able to see some available images and other users are able to see other available images. So I'll provide those credentials when I click on Next, and then we'll see what we can do. Here then we can see that I've got all of these operating systems available. I will, of course, want this Windows 7 reference machine that I uploaded there. And then I want to install into this unallocated space. Now I got to tell you something kind of weird about this. Sometimes, if it's unallocated space, there's no partitions there, I can click on Next here and everything will go just fine. Other times there'll be a red X. This is just part of the nature of some Microsoft products. You have to test these things out in advance. This one's a little unpredictable. I'm using this exact same image. Again, this is a VMware item. And sometimes if I click Next, it'll install. Other times it won't. And I make no changes whatsoever between the two. So we'll see what happens here and if it allows an installation to take place. And goody, here's where it tells me that exact item. Windows cannot prepare the partition selected for installation. Another thing that I found out is that once I click OK here, it's going to go ahead and restart. And if I go ahead and start this process over again, let me reboot that machine. If I start this process over again, sometimes I will see that it has created the 100 megabyte partition for us in advance. And that 100 megabyte partition, what I was referencing there, is where it has to install the boot files, which is actually called the system drive. It's the same partition that we created with ImageX and using the DiskPart utility. And so now then what we see here is after I've rebooted again using the Pixie Boot again to WDS and gone through the whole procedure again, now it shows that it has indeed got some kind of a partition here and it calls it system. This has actually created the 100 megabyte partition on the front end of this, even though we can't really quite see it here. And this is what it did. Even though it gave me that error message, it actually had created a partition. This is again a baffling thing because a lot of times I'll have a 40 gigabyte just raw partition there with nothing on it, and it will acceptably install everything without any problems. Other times I got to go through this whole thing and restart the computer, and surprise, there's a partition there. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next, and now we'll see that the rest of the installation should go just fine. Alright then, I jumped in my little time machine, hit fast forward, and got here to this point where we now have a fully deployed Windows Deployment Services image that's based on our Windows reference image that we captured earlier. And you can see I've got the desktop that I configured with the shortcuts and whatnot, and everything looks just fine. In this nugget, we took a look at imaging. This was part 2, where we used our reference image on our last nugget to capture that image. We want to capture it so that we can deploy it to other machines, and you can use either ImageX, which is a command line utility, to be able to do this, or you can use WDS. The advantage of ImageX is that you can also add batch files, scripts, answers of various types to not fully automate it, but pretty close to fully automate it. I mean, you still have to visit the machine, still have to boot up to WinPE and so forth. But you can also use WDS as a boot capture. This would then, of course, allow you to boot to WDS, capture the reference image, and apply it to a WDS so it's available to select from at a later point in time and apply to destination machines. When you decide to deploy the image, again, you can use ImageX. Again, this can be use answer files for DiskPart. You can also do other things like a batch file to complete the rest of the process for you. And then you can also use Windows Deployment Services as you just saw me do. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.